It's like it's a ritual, right? The constant ablution. I did it too. We've all done it. Okay, we're back. We're going to continue with our discussion on Galbraith and the Affluent Society. Let me just, I can't remember if I've said this already or not, but let me reiterate the point in case I did. In terms of the question of economic security. So we have this idea of patterns of employment and the like. But the main thing that we want to draw our attention to in coming out of this chapter is this balance between microeconomic and macroeconomic effects. So we have the microeconomic effects that create security from things like that I was mentioning before, these sort of government programs, unemployment insurance, etc., things like this. But at the very end of the chapter, he reinforces the importance of these macroeconomic effects, right? Which is that the best way to create economic security in a system where people, in order to survive or to see themselves in a kind of healthy way, is to have a labor market that's capable of granting them a good job for a good wage, is to ensure that there is a healthy level of production that requires workers in order to produce, right? And so just as the question of inequality could be resolved through production, right? Produce more things, people become consumers. Similarly, the idea of economic security can be solved through this question of production. And note what he says, and it's an important point. He says, whether we need or even wish the goods that are produced, their assured production means assured income for those who produce them. This serves the goal of economic security. Nothing else serves it so well. To falter on production, even though that production serves the most unimportant of requirements, is to expose some individuals somewhere to loss of employment and income. This cannot be allowed. Production has become the solvent of the tensions once associated with inequality. Here we have the explanation, or precisely the beginning of the explanation of a modern paradox. Why is it that as production has increased in modern times, we're producing more stuff than ever, concern for production seems also to have increased? Why, as we produce more, should we be yet ever more concerned about producing more? Since the purpose of production is to satisfy human wants and needs, presumably as we produce more, the emphasis on production should decline because we're satisfying those wants and needs. And the answer is, as part of this paradox, because production is not for the satisfaction of human wants and needs at the level of consumption as much as it is to provide the kind of security that this disembedded market system creates. As long as we're producing lots of stuff and everyone can get a job, then we can feel more security working inside of this system. So production becomes a kind of end in and of itself that then upon which the system rests. And the system is not just the economic system. The system involves your sense of well-being inside the system. This goes back to, or helps us to understand, comprehend, reinforces the whole idea of being subordinate to the market, of the market being disembedded from society. Because that emphasis on production as an end in and of itself is striking for the way that it highlights our relationship to the market. We need the market to grant us a job, and the job that we can get is going to then be based on the production function or the production that market is capable of generating. So we need the production of the market in order for the system to work, in order for our well-being to be secured. And we have very little agency in deciding whether the goods that are actually being produced are goods that we want or need or are good for us and so on, right? That's the idea that's here. Maybe a good example of that, I'm not sure, I'm thinking off the top of my head, but a couple of years ago I remember teaching it, and I was down on the classrooms that we have in Maria Molina 4 on the Castellana, and I was in the middle of teaching, and all of a sudden there was all this loud noise from outside, and it was a group of people demonstrating down the Castellana, and they were coal miners from Asturias. They'd come into Madrid to protest against government policies about closing the coal mines. And they were very upset about this. In one world, not having coal miners is a good thing because we know that coal is bad. We should not be putting more coal, we should not be burning coal to put it into our atmosphere. So from a social level, we don't want coal miners. But from a market perspective, if your only way to earn a wage is by going down into the mine and mining coal, you absolutely want coal mines, right? And this is an example of the kind of paradox that this creates. And it's a good example of the way in which the agency that we as a society have in order to determine what markets are producing is, to say the least, complex, if not, in fact, very significantly compromised. Okay, I hope that's clear. So let's turn then to the last part, the question of what he calls the paramount position of production, which at this point you should see the argument falling into place. If the problems of inequality inside the system can be solved better, not through redistribution, but instead through higher production, and if the problems of economic insecurity can be alleviated, not through microeconomic factors, but more so through macroeconomic factors, consistent production, then you can see that production, the capacity of the system to produce things, is going to take a strikingly important role at the center of the entire system. And he draws our attention to something which I think is as true now as it was back then, which is the importance that we give to the idea of expanding our economies. It is important for our economies perpetually to be growing. This is a problem inside of all firms, right? Firms always want to be improving their results, and that same kind of mindset exists at a social scale when it comes to the assessment of the countries in which we live. So therefore, you want to be able to be showing positive growth, because positive growth reinforces or is linked to, inextricably linked to that sense of economic well-being and economic security. And the curious thing is that insistence on growth, your national expansion of your GDP, is absolute. And I can think of no better example to demonstrate the divorce, or the way that the logic between growth and reality is divorced, than to look at the case of Japan, which has a very rapidly shrinking population. Common sense would tell you if your population is rapidly shrinking, what should be happening to your GDP? It should be shrinking as well. Gross domestic product should be some positively correlated function with population. And yet, in Japan, if you look at government policies over the last 20 years, they've all been, quote, pro-growth. It's a perennial problem. Why is the Japanese economy not growing? All these kinds of measures to try and get the Japanese economy to grow. Whereas it should be perfectly reasonable to say, well, if you're about to lose half your population in the space of 2 generations, it's not unreasonable to think that the economy that you have is going to be a lot smaller than it once was. And yet, it tells you the degree to which we have untethered or separated the principles of economic growth from the kind of underlying purpose that they serve, which is to produce things for the people who live in these economies, right? If there are simply less of us to consume, it stands to reason that we don't need to produce as much. But that's not the world we live in. We take that number in and of itself. What's the growth rate of Spain this year going to be? Oh, it's only 1.3%. It's like, Spain also has a declining population. Therefore, it's not unreasonable, or at least an aging population, so the pattern of consumption is declining. It's not unreasonable to think that more or less stagnant growth should be part of the economic landscape. And yet, instead of reading that as somehow linked to the demographic reality, we read this as a problem of economic malaise. Not to mention the fact, as you probably are well aware, in a country like Spain, which has chronically high youth unemployment, we see then that the best path out of that, the kinds of problems of economic insecurity that chronically high youth unemployment creates, is to think about how do we expand production? How do we expand the economy? And a lot of the political language that we're used to hearing is centered around pro-growth, pro-employment policies and the like. So this, what does he call it? Paramount position of production is more true, or I should say truer than ever. And yet, isn't this the core paradox that we want to explore in this classroom, and a core paradox that will become poignantly and tragically visible with every passing year? And I don't mean to be preachy, but I want to just reinforce my underlying sense of concern. Everything that we buy, everything that we do that involves the market, since the market is dependent upon fossil fuels for its energy, every time we use the market, we're simply adding to the problems that we're already encountering in terms of future climate change. And so we're using the very thing that's actually endangering, if not our existence, then certainly the pattern of existence that we've enjoyed up until this point. This is the kind of fundamental problem that at least I see. Anyway, okay, so the paramount importance of production. The importance of production transcends our boundaries, right? The idea is that all countries, once they industrialize, production becomes central to their DNA, to the way that the way that people think about themselves. Goods are comparatively abundant, yet production remains central to our thoughts. It continues to measure the quality and progress of our civilization. Our preoccupation with production is in fact the culminating consequence of powerful historical and psychological forces which only by an act of will we can hope to escape. Let me pause a little bit on this idea, because I think this demonstrates the kinds of challenges that we're facing, particularly in the light of climate change. But it's not really in terms of climate change. It's in terms of a market that's reliant upon fossil fuels in order to generate the production that we've come to expect. That's the fundamental paradox. If we could snap our fingers and overnight change the energy input to create all the goods that we consume to some kind of sustainable energy base, it would be a lot better. But we can't do that. We're still reliant, countries like China, Germany, and so on, right? Many of the leading industrial countries are still distressingly reliant upon fossil fuels for their market activity. And we're aware of that. So our preoccupation with production, only an act of will we can hope to escape. To me, that act of will comes back to what I call belief. In order for us to somehow resolve this, we are going to need collectively, and collectively meaning not just us in this room, but at a global level, a collective change in our underlying belief structure in what these markets are there to do, and in the kinds of societies that we live in. How realistic is that we can collectively, as a planet, just change our belief structure? I'm not particularly optimistic. But I think it's important that we grasp what's at stake. We should at least be informed, even if we can't necessarily see our way to systemic change. So, I'm going to skip through. He has some interesting stuff in here which I draw to your attention. One of the interesting things that he has to say, actually highlighted by the pandemic that we see. The pandemic has created an extraordinary moment for us to think about investment in technology. Because in order for us to remove these masks, and we were all here in the classroom diligently washing our hands, so to move into a world where we're not constantly abluting ourselves, will require, right, a significant investment in the vaccine technologies that now are being deployed across the world. And we saw that different countries. The interesting thing is, at least in the West, I don't know exactly how they're doing it in China or in Russia, but in the West, it's curious that we relied upon the free market, private firms, right, to develop those vaccine technologies. The reason I'm highlighting that is because, to me at least, a vaccine that helps the global population overcome a pandemic would seem to me a social good. And it perhaps points to some of the paradoxes that in the context of this system, that in order to generate a social good, we've privatized the creation of that social good. Privatized its creation, we've also privatized its profits, even though there was public money that was spent through companies to help develop these kinds of vaccines. Nonetheless, the profits that derive from those vaccines are themselves will be privatized and handed over to shareholders. To me, that seems like a deeply troubling development. There ought to be space in our system for societies to use markets for social benefit, as opposed to this insistence that markets have to constantly operate for private benefit in order for them to be efficient. Where that idea has come from, I think, is simply the product of this many decades of a certain belief structure having been erected around the relationship that we have to this market system. And it might be hoped for that in the aftermath of this debacle, which is the distribution of vaccines, and even if Europe manages to get its act together and vaccinate people, the very fact that we're vaccinating people based on the ability to pay and not as a general social good, which means that there are going to be people in countries like Thailand or Botswana or Nigeria who will not be vaccinated, or at least not for a while because of their inability to pay, that hopefully that absurdity and the serious health complications it could create for us, because those become laboratories and breeding grounds for new variants, which then have the risk of reinfecting us, that the absurdity of that approach might be highlighted, and we might think that, in fact, we should be rethinking the structures around which we leverage resources to generate goods. So let me jump to towards the end here. To point 5. There is another respect in which our concern for production is traditional and irrational. We are, he writes, curiously unreasonable in the distinctions we make between different kinds of goods and services. We view the production of some of the most frivolous goods with pride. We regard the production of some of the most significant and civilizing services with regret. And here he's discussing that exactly this point between private and what we might think of as a private-public mode of production, right? So private production, things like clothes and computers and all the things that we buy as consumer goods. Public production would be things like universities or schools, roads, parks, right? All the public facilities that we demand. And there's another paradox that he draws our attention to in this discussion, which is that as societies become more prosperous, they start to demand the furnishing of public goods at a much higher degree than our ancestors ever did. Our ancestors living in the cities of 100 or 200 years ago weren't demanding parks and playgrounds for their kids and nice quiet streets with public lighting and nice trees and police forces and all this kind of stuff. All of those elements of modern life that we think of as part of the structure of our public structure of our society are all driven by the larger conditions of affluence that the system has created. And yet the curious thing is that even as we've come to benefit extraordinarily from the investment that we're making in these kinds of public goods, at the same time, we remain deeply suspicious of the idea of investing in public goods, as demonstrated by the fact that we've privatized the production and profits of a vaccine against a global pandemic. Where does that come from? And from Galbraith's perspective, this is not just some universal law of the market that private markets are always more efficient than public ones, and therefore, if we want to actually have anything that's decent, we have to privatize it, we have to put it into private hands, we have to put it through the profit motive. From his perspective, it's much more about mindset, mentality, thinking, right? That it's the way in which we are being conditioned to think, or as I like to say, the belief structure that we've come to acquire about the nature of the markets around us. Remember, we're human beings, armed with imagination and the power for abstract thought. We can believe anything. It just so happens that we believe this one thing because of the peculiar combination of historical forces that has led us to this particular belief. But in a different period of time or in a different place, we would believe something entirely different. So we must always be suspect or suspicious of being presented with these things as if they're some kind of universal rule. Nothing that human beings create out of their heads is a universal rule. It's all contingent on our own capacity for collective imagination and collective belief systems. Here's the thing. This question then of not being able to prioritize goods in the context of production. Once a society has provided itself with food, clothing, and shelter, all of which so happily lend themselves to private production, purchase, and sale, the people in that society start to want other things. And a remarkable number of these things do not lend themselves to such production, purchase, and sale. They must be provided for everyone if they are to provide it for anyone. And they must be paid for collectively or they cannot be paid for at all, right? Public streets, public lighting, nice parks, playgrounds, nice schools for our kids to go to, etc., right? This becomes... Nevertheless, these services, although they reflect increasingly urgent desires, so something we really want, good schools for our kids, remain under the obloquy of the unreliability, incompetence, cost, and pretentious interference of princes. Our natural suspicion, he seems to be saying, of government means that even though these are public goods that we're providing for ourselves via the instrument of government, we nonetheless treat it as with suspicion on the idea that in providing this money through government, somehow we're getting less than what we paid for. Sort of the idea. Okay, let me see. Move to here. Let's go to the summary. By way of summary then, while production has come to have a goal of preeminent importance in our life, it is not a goal which we pursue either comprehensively or even very thoughtfully. Part of that we can see then in this distinction that we make between private production and public goods, public production. And we're very passive about this. And he says we need to understand why we're passive. Why are we passive about the seeming irrationality of production? I don't know about you. I hope this is not the case, because I hope this is just a condition of my significant age. But I have to say, I live near Gran Via. And some of you may know that on Gran Via there's a Primark, which I think of as like the modern cathedral. Like people line, in the way that people used to line up for Mass, the old cathedrals, take communion, be saved, but they line up in front of the Primark. And when we came out of lockdown last spring, I remember walking up Primark, and the line to get into Primark was just mind-bogglingly long, right? It's just like, anyway. I'm not judging, I'm just saying. So, what does Primark do, right? I've never been in Primark. As a sort of matter of principle, I've not walked into them. But if I understand it correctly, the whole point about Primark is that it sells a wide range of consumer products, like clothing, whatever, that are so cheap that they're essentially disposable. Is that more or less a reasonable characterization of Primark? I don't want to be unfair. I just found out actually that the founder of Primark is a fellow Canadian, so I want to show some respect. But that's my understanding. Now, it's not Primark's fault that it has found a way to make a great success of an economy based on the principle of disposable goods. But what's striking to me, and this is what upsets me a little bit and gives me some concern, is that if you are aware, as I hope we all are now if we weren't before, that every time we use the market, we make the existing climate emergency just a little bit worse. And yet, at the same time, we are encouraging or being encouraged to engage in a pattern of consumption which is now being increasingly built around the principle of disposability, to buy things that are so cheap that we can just throw them away and we'll buy another one when we need it, right? That is a very disturbing development, at least as I see it, as I interpret it, because just as we should be inculcating the exact opposite mindset. We should be wanting people to think about being careful about how they consume. Think about what it is that you buy, and think about the consequences of that purchase. And instead, we seem to be going the other way. Be less careful about what you buy. And compared to Galbraith's time, we're much more promiscuous in our consumption. When he was writing, there was no EasyJet or Ryanair that could take 49 euros and you could fly off to Portugal for the day and so on. So just as at the very time as common sense reason tells us, we should be pursuing patterns of consumption with more diligence and concern and citizenship. At the same time, we seem to be seeing patterns of consumption that are exactly the opposite. And to me, I find that rather distressing. This is, I bring this up because I think this, to me, speaks to what he calls our passivity in the question of how we think about consumption. We're passive in terms of being critical about the consumption that we engage in. We are not sufficiently concerned to have recourse to the measures by which production could be efficiently increased. None of this would be possible if the goods we produce were of great and urgent importance. This is true. If we were living in an environment where we didn't have enough food to eat or enough shelter to keep us protected from the elements or enough clothes to wear, then it wouldn't matter. But we have satisfied all those basic wants, right? The society has easily satisfied all of the most basic wants of people in wealthy, industrialized, and post-industrial societies. Yet, even as we've managed to satisfy those fundamental wants, consumer wants are being encouraged to increase, not decrease, which is then putting stress upon the marketplace in exactly the wrong way, right? To produce more using, as we know, this kind of slow-acting, and it's not even that slow-acting, poison in order to produce it. Which brings us then to the last two parts of the discussion, the imperatives of consumer demand, and finally the interdependence effect. So we've seen that the basis for an emphasis on production is not the basic satisfaction of human wants and needs. Those can be easily satisfied. The additional emphasis on production beyond that is because production is fundamentally necessary to alleviate the problems of inequality that the system creates through not redistribution, but by providing greater access to goods. And additionally, to solve the problem of economic security by, through production, offering wage employment to the many members of our society who require it. So production serves this kind of fundamental structural necessity in order for the system to work for the people affected by it, right? The people who are operating under this system of a capitalist means of production. However, if you're producing a lot, what then justifies the production? You don't produce stuff just to say, well, I have a job and then throw it away. Although, frankly, if you think about it, that would be better. We could pay coal miners to go down the mine and not mine coal. That would be far better off for us than paying them to actually produce a product and selling it into the marketplace. He says, production, note here, must have a raison d'etre of its own. It must actually be there for a purpose. So if I'm producing lots of stuff, right, production links to what? To demand. So therefore, we create a world of consumer demand. And it's in this construction of consumer demand that we start to shift from, or we see the shift from thinking of ourselves as producers, which none of us really thinks of ourselves as, to instead seeing ourselves as consumers. Because the culture that's emerged around us all emphasizes our role as consumers, right? The internet is supported largely by internet advertising. Why does it make sense to advertise to Allegra here in the room if she's browsing the web? Not that I'm accusing you of doing that, but when you later browse the web, why does it make sense to put advertisements on her screen? Because primarily, her primary function is not as a producer, but instead, what do the advertisers want to do to you, Allegra? They want to convince you to do what? Buy their products. If you buy somebody's product, what does that make you? A consumer, right? Our whole world is built around the idea that your role is as a consumer, to consume, right? And he points out, and I'm not going to engage in the tedious business of reading this, but he points out that you can tell that this, as it were, pattern of consumption is largely artificial because the wants that they create, the wants that are that are satisfied by production are, as he puts it, created by the production itself. Which sounds sort of paradoxical, but the point is, if the whole system relies upon an abundance of production, you're then going to have to create a market for all the things that you are producing. And that's the kind of logic that we've created inside of the system. And he points particularly to the role of advertising and marketing as being fundamental. Marketing, the purpose of marketing, and those of you who are thinking about careers in marketing, as you should know by now, right? I think we've talked about this already. Marketing is all about telling people a story. Another way of thinking about that is marketing is about telling people why they want your product, right? That's what marketing is. Why should I buy your product? And look at the way we get marketed to. Buying a car, for instance, I was hectoring my students about this morning. It's one of the reasons my class was so disastrous. I won't do it again. But when we buy a car, the car makers have an entire marketing strategy not for selling us a car, but for selling us a lifestyle, an image that we have of ourselves. The kind of car you drive redounds to the kind of person you either want to be or feel that you are, right? And so this notion of a world in which all these different cars are being produced, the need for those cars, and don't get me wrong, it feels like a real need. I'd love tomorrow to be able to step into my nice new Mercedes or something. It would be great. But you also have to recognize that the need that you feel for that good is itself a construct, right? It's an artificial creation. You may have underlying utilitarian need for some means of conveyance, a means of vehicular conveyance to move you from point A to point B. To satisfy the underlying utility of the need, or the underlying nature of the need, the utility of the good simply has to be able to move you from point A to point B. Could be a Honda Civic, right? Could be a very, very nice car. Anything above that, now we're back into the world of Veblen goods, right? We're being sold waste. But that waste, all that additional value that's captured in the wasteful nature of the product, right, links back then to this need for production, right? The need for production. The more I can convince consumers to embrace a disposable mindset, buy a good, throw it away, exchange it for a better good. How many of us have phones somewhere in a drawer that work perfectly well, but we traded it up for another phone? Or even worse, building in sneakily planned obsolescence So we're forced to go back into the marketplace and buy another product, says Rolf, looking annoyed and angry at his iPhone. Right? The whole purpose of that is linked to this kind of a construct of consumption. Let me see if I can find where he says it. He talks about the concept of diminishing marginal utility, which I'm assuming you know from your economics class, right? That in theory, as we produce more of these goods, there should be a diminishing marginal utility of the goods that we're producing. But that's not the effect that we observe. In fact, if anything, it's the reverse. And so therefore, the question is, how do we explain this curious phenomenon? And the answer is because the needs that are being satisfied, which ordinarily ought to follow a standard marginal utility curve, that's not how they operate. They're operating at a psychological level in which we as the consumer are constantly being preyed upon to consume. But at the same time, we're part of that system because we recognize that the nature of our consumption is necessary for us to maintain our well-being in this system. And because we have no agency over that system, since the market is above us, it means that we see this act of consumption can almost be framed as involuntary. It's necessary in order for the system to continue to work in a way that then allows us to have well-being. Let's see if I can find this. The next little quote that's somewhere here. I think I underlined it. Oh, maybe not. No, since the average consumer owns only a fraction of the different kinds of goods he might conceivably possess, there is all but unlimited opportunity for additional such products. The rewards to the possessors are more or less proportional to supply. The production that supplies these goods and services, since it renders undiminished utility, remains of undiminished importance. There's always another vacation you can take, another nice set of clothes that you can buy, another nice set of shoes that you can wear, right? That in other words, that the idea of diminished utility simply doesn't work in the context of this kind of consumer environment. I can't find the quote. The quote says something along the lines of that it's the nature of production that then actually creates the demand. And he has it nicely phrased, but I'm not finding it. So let me move. Maybe it's in the next chapter. Maybe that's why I'm not finding it. Actually, maybe it's in the dependence effect. Okay, so we're going to end here, and your weekend will soon begin. So I appreciate very much your patience for bearing with me, and we'll quickly draw to a close. So the dependence effect. We'll skip the strict economics here. If the individual's wants are to be urgent, they must be original with himself. An urgent want, for example, you're hungry, you need to eat, right? They cannot be urgent if they must be contrived for him. And above all, they must not be contrived by the process of production by which they are satisfied. For this means that the whole case for the urgency of production, based on the urgency of wants, falls to the ground. One cannot defend production as satisfying wants if it is, this is the quote I wanted, if that production creates the wants. That yen that you have for, I don't know, some super nice car or nice clothes or whatever it might be, if it's the production of the car itself that's creating the want, we can't use your want to justify the production, right? That's what he's saying, that it's linked together. And he's got this fun little thing. Were it so that a man on arising each morning was assailed by demons, which instilled in him a passion sometimes for silk shirts, sometimes for kitchenware, sometimes for chamber pots, and sometimes for orange squash, there would be every reason to applaud the effort to find the goods, however odd, that quenched this flame. But should it be that his passion was the result of his first having cultivated the demons, and should it also be that his effort to allay that passion stirred the demons to ever greater and greater effort, there would be question as to how rational was his solution. Unless restrained by conventional attitudes, he might wonder if the solution lay with more goods or fewer demons. So it is that if production creates the wants it seeks to satisfy, or if the wants emerge pari passu with the production, meaning at the same time as, then the urgency of the wants can no longer be used to defend the urgency of the production. Production fills a void that production itself has created. And this then he calls the dependence effect, that the nature of consumer demand and our need for production end up being linked interdependently. So another way of thinking about that is our system of affluence that we've created. This is where he talks about advertising. Sorry, it's in this chapter where he talks about advertising. As he says, the even more direct link between production and wants is provided by the institutions of modern advertising and salesmanship. They cannot be reconciled with the notion of independently determined desires, for their central function is to create the desire, to bring into being wants that previously did not exist, and so on. So the point then is to come to an end, because I appreciate I've been preying upon your patience for quite a long time. As I've noted here, the implications of the paradox of producers creating wants for the goods that they produce is that it discourages examination of the underlying social value of the goods being produced. They become an end in and of themselves, right? And it's not really that, I shouldn't put it exactly like that, because the whole system that can establish well-being inside of this structure then becomes dependent on production. Since production and consumption then become mutually reinforcing, it means that our modern identity as consumers fundamentally is inextricably linked to our sense of well-being. Why do I use the word well-being? Because our sense of well-being derives in this system from what? It derives from the ability to be able successfully and in a way that satisfies your own sense of who you are. It depends upon your ability to take your labor and turn it into a wage, and maybe more than just a wage, into a career that you feel satisfies your underlying aspirations and ambitions. So we have no way of conceiving our lives outside of this market paradigm. Therefore, the well-being that we want for ourselves through the living of those lives is dependent upon that market paradigm. Since the success and strength of the market paradigm is reliant on on production, but production then is reliant on consumption, it locks us into a vicious spiral, into a vicious cycle. And this is the reason why I fear that even as the encroaching climate emergency becomes more and more obvious, it's going to be very difficult for us to do anything about it. Because in order for us to take the measures needed to redress this problem, we actually have to, at a very basic level, compromise our own sense of well-being. And what rational individual would like to do that? That's an irrational act, to act in a way that goes against your sense of well-being. It's not your fault. It's because the well-being that you seek can only be expressed through the successful operation of this structure that's around you. And you have no alternative short of, becoming a mountain man or some other social outcast or social rejecting society, which is not what most of us wish for ourselves. So we're just locked into this cycle that's carrying us forward to ever more troubling places. That's, I think, the issue that we need to confront. And I don't know how we confront it. I wish I had a better answer. I am still, as I've mentioned before, dismayed that, it's pretty clear, this is not a market solution. The market has made this problem. The market is unlikely to be able to solve this problem. And the problem is not technology. The problem is the people. We're the problem, right? It's we created this institution. We are part of this institution. How do we get out of this institution that we collectively believe in, but as a result of that collective belief is threatening the security of our future existence? And that's not going to be a market solution. That has to be people themselves. What do we call it when people express their beliefs in a collective way? We call that politics. So we need a political solution. And I remain distressed and dismayed, although hopefully things will change, but I remain distressed and dismayed to see what I consider to be remarkably weak and anemic political responses to what is a very, very serious problem. Just suggests that as a society, we're not yet mature enough to be able to recognize the conundrum that we've been placed into, despite the fact that Galbraith wrote this book long before anybody was aware that the climate was a problem, and long before the kinds of paradoxes that it creates have become as visible as they are today. So we've known about this for 70 years, that underlying the whole system of industrial and post-industrial affluence is a kind of unsustainable paradox. Nothing can keep growing forever. If the only way we can maintain our well-being is to keep growing forever, we need to find a different way of defining our well-being. That's the central paradox that Galbraith wants to address our attention to. He didn't even need the fact that this constant need for growth is in fact, in the end, producing a kind of looming climate catastrophe, because the sense of this, the unsustainability of it is simply embedded inside that logic. You can't have perpetual growth in a world of limited resources. So we do need to find a way to think our way through this problem. As I say, I don't want to be particularly despairing, but I'm not especially optimistic. Finally, this is the point that I've underlined here. It's a key point. As a society becomes increasingly affluent, wants are increasingly created by the process by which they are satisfied. This may operate passively. Increases in consumption, the counterpart of increases in production. Increases in consumption, the counterpart of increases in production, act by suggestion or emulation to create wants. Expectations rise with attainment, or producers may proceed actively to create wants through advertising and salesmanship. Wants thus come to depend on output. In technical terms, it can no longer be assumed that welfare is greater at an all-round higher level of production than at a lower one. It may be the same. The higher level of production has merely a higher level of want creation, necessitating a higher level of want satisfaction. There will be frequent occasion to refer to the way wants depend on the process by which they're satisfied, and he decides to call it what he calls the dependence effect. This is the conundrum, right? That there's no end point. There's no point you say, oh, we've got enough. Instead, the very act of having more simply increases the urgency of the wants that you then develop. And that's what then produces these lines in front of the Primark near my house. I feel like I've left us on a kind of a down note here, and I apologize for that. But let's be honest, it's a kind of a depressing environment that we're in. So we have to speak honestly about these things if we're to be able to think our way forward. I would say, and I have to say, I've been teaching about this, it does distress me a great deal that seeing people who are just 20 years old, who had very little to do with this problem, are going to be the ones who have to clean it up. It's like the person who pees all over the bathroom, pees all over the toilet and leaves it for the next person to come and clean up. So on behalf of my generation, I apologize for our incredible irresponsibility. There may be a solution. So actually, I shouldn't go so far as to say that. I'm not here to trade in the game of false hope. But I want to draw our attention, and we come back next time. We have two readings that remain outstanding to us. One is the ancillary process whereby this pattern of consumption is enabled, and that means giving people the ability to purchase, right? One of the ways that this whole system works is you have to then be able to create a meaningful consumer. As you're increasing then the level of production, you're going to have to increase the level of consumption. What happens because of the way that inequality works? What happens if the increase in real income is not operating quickly enough to match the increase in production that you want? And this is a fundamental paradox that's inside of our system. It can get a little bit technical. For those of you who are interested in the technical side of it, I address you to, or I commend to your attention the work of Thomas Piketty, his book Capital in the 21st Century, which looks at that kind of fundamental paradox. But stressed or expressed very simply, in a world of increasing production, since the value that production creates concentrates preponderantly in the hands of the people who have capital as opposed to the people who are earning a wage. So that's just a restatement of the Marxist formulation, that the profits concentrate more in the hands of the owners of the means of production than they do in the hands of the producers. Since the producer is now the consumer, it creates a problem. Because if you just imagine that as a simple arithmetic problem, you'll see that there's going to be a point where the production is outpacing the ability to consume, and then suddenly there's no demand for the goods. The whole consumption system falls apart, and there you go. So what have we done in order to solve that problem? And it's not just solved the problem; it's hyper-accelerated it. Is we have turned the nature of our consumption, or we've made our pattern of consumption more robust by allowing it to rest on the foundations of a credit-based society. So most of us in this room will fund the major purchases of our life, like houses or cars, through the use of consumer credit vehicles, right? Mortgages and car loans. Maybe some of you have student debt, right? All of these kinds of things. So we've created an entire world of debt that's accessible to the average average consumer, except maybe we should put it another way. We've created an entire world of credit that's available to the average producer, and by granting her access to that credit, we've turned her from producer into consumer. I want to talk about that through the Calder reading that we have, so we'll do that maybe next time, and also talk about Schumpeter, who I think matters a great deal for people in the BBA, because he talks about the decline of the entrepreneurial function, which I hope will be of some interest to you. Let's put a final tease out there. Does anybody know what product it was that sort of spurred? I don't know. I got to go check with the reading, make sure I'm not wrong on this, but I think this is true. What product it was that was sort of revolutionized approaches to consumer credit? Because it was built around a very specific consumer product. Turned it into a mass consumer item. Does anybody know what it was? Anyone online? I'm not sure if anyone's still with us online. Is anyone still with us online? Yeah. Thank you, Carola. We were worried. Okay, one. I mean, you can't blame anybody on a Friday afternoon, for checking out a little bit early. Carola, I appreciate you're giving up your Friday afternoon for all this nonsense. The answer is the automobile. The automobile was too expensive for the average person to be able to afford. And there were these two approaches to getting people to buy an automobile. The Ford Motor Company used a very, what I would call, Protestant approach. The idea was you could set up a Ford Motor Company savings account, and you would put money in every month, and when you had enough in your savings account, then you'd get your car, right? So it was like paying it by installments, but you only got the product once you'd actually put enough money in. And General Motors, I believe it was General Motors, came along, and they did exactly the reverse. We'll give you your car right now, and you can pay it off later. Which do you think the consumer preferred? Of course, right? Rapid. And the interesting reason why is because in order for the car market to expand, it needed to actually create the market for the car. It had to move it from being just something that could be purchased by the leisure class to instead make it an everyday consumer product. And so as part of that, the notion of consumer credit, it's a very innovative thing. The whole idea of consumer credit, being able to use your future earning power to buy goods today. And it's not just being able to buy goods today, but then it transforms the kind of life you lead. Because if you are somebody with an automobile, it means you can live in a different part of the city. You can do different kinds of things. So it had this very transformational effect. And you can see right away that once that guy who was working in the factory, the first day he sits down in his new car, you can just see the impact, the huge positive impact psychologically on that kind of mindset. And so this is the system that we've been living with for the last 100 years. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate it. So Carola, appreciate very much. Props to you for being with us this afternoon. It's Martine, isn't it? And Allegra, so thank you for coming today. Everyone else online, give a wave. Anyway, have a great weekend. Enjoy your night out. And I will see you guys in, I believe, 2 weeks.